Welcome to the de Bartolo Performing Arts Center at the University of Notre Dame. Please use this moment to take your phones out and ensure they are on silent mode. Photography, texting, or recording is prohibited. For your safety, please take a moment to locate the nearest exit, which may be different from the entrance you used. Our usher staff is here to assist you in case of an emergency. Visit performingarts.nd.edu for upcoming events, news, and information. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening. My name is Katie Boogish, and I'm an assistant professor in the program of liberal studies in the College of Arts and Letters here at the University of Notre Dame. It is my great privilege to welcome you this evening to the first lecture in the Sister Kathleen Canon Distinguished Lecture Series for the 2021-2022 academic year. We are very fortunate this evening to have Sister Kathleen herself in the audience. It is fitting that this lecture series should be named after Sister Kathleen, because it was designed to share the work of extraordinary women, both from within and beyond the academy, here at the community at Notre Dame. This lecture series is an enduring witness to her extraordinary efforts to make this university a place where women students, staff, and faculty can thrive. I am grateful for the support I received from the Canon Distinguished Lecture Series, as well as from the Creative Writing Program, the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism, the Gender Studies Program, the Institute for Scholarship in the Liberal Arts Henkel's Lecture Fund, the Medieval Institute, the Nanovic Institute for European Studies, Notre Dame Research, and my home department, the Program of Liberal Studies, to bring tonight's speaker to campus. Lauren Groff is one of the greatest writers of our time. She is the author of 6 works of fiction, 2 short story collections, and 4 novels, all received with resounding acclaim, including the one that she will share with us this evening, Matrix, published by Riverhead Books in September. Her works, quite justly, have won numerous awards: the Story Prize, the ABA Indies Choice Award, France's Grand Prix de l'Héroïne, a finalist twice for the Kirkus Prize, and 3 consecutive times for the National Book Award, including for Matrix, a feat achieved by only 2 other writers, Vladimir Nabokov and Rachel Carson, a testament to the consistency of Lauren's greatness as a writer. She has received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and from the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. It was at Radcliffe that the 2 of us became dear friends, drawn together by our deep love of medieval nuns. Matrix is a bold, luminous reimagining of the life of the 12th century poet Marie de France, as first an unwilling entrant into, and then the nearly unanimously elected abbess of a Benedictine monastery in England. The medievalists in the audience know that mostly all that can be recovered of who Marie was must be excavated from the writings that bear her name or have been attributed to her, and these details are precious few. The elusiveness of Marie's identity makes her life a rich site for exploration, especially with a literary imagination as vivid and capacious as Lauren's. The Marie Lauren creates is the proud descendant of a famous family of viragos, women who resisted and exceeded the expectations that society set to limit the roles that their sex could perform. Her grandmother, mother, and aunts were all well-educated, imposing in stature, and fiercely independent. So too is Marie. In Matrix, this reluctant nun and abbess marshals the traits and gifts of her matrilineal inheritance, not just to revitalize, but to transform a dying religious community into a veritable city of ladies, a place where women can exercise their powers and creativities completely free from men. It is Marie's passion for greatness, not her goodness, that inspires her to become the very matrix that gestates her nuns. Near the end of her life, the narrator tells us, Marie saw at that moment how she could use this greatness for her sisters. She could give up the burn of singular love inside her and turn to a larger love. She could build around the other women an abbey of the spirit to protect them from cold and wet, from superiors waiting to gobble them up. She would build an invisible abbey made out of her very own self, a larger church of her own soul, an edifice of self in which her sisters would grow as babes grow in the dark, thrumming heat of the womb. In writing and publishing this novel, Lauren has proven herself akin to Marie. She used her greatness to turn to a larger love, to build a world out of her very own self, and to invite us to grow within it. This is hospitality, just as Saint Benedict instructed in his rule. Believing this, I feel very fortunate that we have invited Lauren to Notre Dame so that we, in turn, may extend hospitality to her. It is thus my great pleasure to welcome my dear friend, Lauren Groff, to the stage.
Hi. I am so happy to see human beings. Hello. We're back, sort of. This is great. So before I begin, I would like to do a little land acknowledgement. We acknowledge our presence on the traditional homelands of Native peoples, including the Haudenosaunee, Miami, Peoria, and particularly the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi, who have been using this land for education for hundreds of years and continue to do so. Okay. And before I begin with what I'm about to speak about, I have to say thank you. I am full of gratitude. Your hospitality has been mind-boggling. First of all, of course, to Katie and Eric Bookish, who have invited me into their unbelievably gorgeous home. I did not know South Bend had such a beautiful neighborhood as the one they're in, and I get to play with a 2-year-old all day long, so it's like wonderful. Katie's unbelievably compelling scholarship planted the seed for this book, and I will talk about that in a minute. But she also had such extraordinary grace in blessing my work with her intelligence, and she has so much generosity in causing me to come here, and she put so much work into this, so I'm profoundly grateful. And I'm going to speak more about how much I owe to her, and I owe to her a great deal. But also, thank you, University of Notre Dame. Thank you to the program in Liberal Studies, the Medieval Institute, and the Creative Writing Program. And also, across the road, St. Mary's beautiful and ferocious little gem of a women's college, too. It's really wonderful. Thank you, Sister Kathleen Cannon. I really, really appreciate this. So, what I want to do tonight is to tell you the origins of Matrix specifically in order to maybe give an idea of how a novel in a larger sense is built out of layers of information, sort of intersectional passions. To me, as a writer, they become palimpsests of astonishment, and hopefully, when they hit the hands of the reader, they are palimpsests of astonishment also. So I will go through the large elements that went into the book, then the impediments that kept me from writing it as well as I could, and then the threads. My art is an art of synthesis, as you will see, which is really hopeful for the creative writers out there because you just keep synthesizing, and eventually one day you come up with something. So the first thing that we're going to, technology. This is exciting. Okay, first thing we're going to do is talk about Marie de France. So I have loved Marie since my undergraduate days. And if there are undergraduates in the audience here, there are things that you are going to learn about now that you will carry with you as friends through the rest of your lives. And I think that that's a profoundly moving and delightful thing, that you will be host to these elements that you just love forever. That's so wonderful. I went to Amherst College. It's a small liberal arts college in Massachusetts. It's a great school. I am an introvert, and excuse me, I don't do seminars very well. So I tried to take very tiny classes, and I eventually hit upon this idea, which was if I went to my favorite professors and I asked them to do a tutorial, they usually said yes. So I had mostly tutorials at Amherst, which is so privileged. So I was in a tutorial with Dr. Paul Rockwell, whom I love very much. And we were doing Ancien Français, and I fell so much in love with the lay of Marie de France. Now, there are many people in the audience who know a great deal more about her and her lay than I do. But Katie already talked about some of the things that we do know. We don't know a lot about this incredible figure. She was the first published female poet in the French language that we know of. There are a lot of anonymouses. They were probably women, just saying. But there are suppositions, I believe, and the suppositions, some of them are she could have been an abbess in an abbey. She was from France, obviously, it's in her name, in an abbey in England. Some people say Shaftesbury. Some people say she could have been possibly the first daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, Marie from her first marriage to Louis VII. Nobody really knows because at the time, unless you were a saint, you were really only interesting as a woman through your relation, through relational, the way that you were interesting was through your husband or your son or your father. And that's a shame, but it was sort of an invitation to me back way long ago, over 20 years ago, because I knew that I could do something with this absence, this blank in the historical record. So time passed, obviously. Wait, this is the lay. Sorry, I just wanted to give you a little taste of it. So I'm not going to inflict my old French on you, and you're welcome. But I will do a little bit of the English here. This is my friend Judy Sho from the University of Florida who did this, and she just handed me her book, so I put it in here. Whoever gets knowledge from God, science, and a talent for speech, eloquence, shouldn't shut up or hide away. No, that person should gladly display. When everyone hears about some great good, then it flourishes as it should. When folks praise it at full power, then the good deeds in full flower. So that's from the prologue for the lay, and I put it there because I actually put it into Matrix. And there are a lot of things that I went through both the lay and the fables of Marie de France, and I made a sort of a prose poem out of the vivid images and the ideas, and then sort of extrapolated a life from there. Okay, so 20 years ago, I fell in love with Marie de France. Then, in 2018 to 2019, there was a cohort at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies at Harvard University. Those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's for a hermit like me, a mind-blowing experience. Because what you get to do when you go to Radcliffe is be around experts, brilliant thinkers in their fields. And there are astrophysicists, there are geologists, there are biologists, there are sculptors, and we all come together. And the purpose of this fellowship is to share ideas and knowledge. Ideas and knowledge that perhaps ahead of time you would not have thought were interesting, but which when you get there, you find so compelling you can't let them go. And I actually, when I was there, I was working on a project called The Vaster Wilds. It's about 1609 in Jamestown. But I thought at the beginning, I thought I was going to write another novel about black holes because I was surrounded by astrophysicists, and black holes are amazing. I don't know how a novel would look, what it would look like with black holes, but it would be incredible. So the night before I had my semi-secular vision, I was on a plane coming back from Arizona for a talk, and I see this movie. It'll be familiar to some of you, probably not all. It's an amazing film. It's a 1939 film called The Women by George Cukor. George Cukor also did The Philadelphia Story, which is my #1 favorite film of all times. This one is just as funny. It's very strange. It's written, by the way, this is just a little aside, by Anita Luce. And if you're in the market for the funniest novel you've ever read, she wrote Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. So good. So I watched this film. It's black and white. The only characters in this film are women. And I was so thrilled at the same time because it's from 1939. And you see the tagline here, it's all about men. That every conversation in this film is about men. So it was immensely frustrating. Some of you may know the Bechdel test. This is something composed by the writer Alison Bechdel, who is a cartoonist. She wrote 2 biographies. They're called graphic novels, but they're not novels. But they are autobiographies. And she had a comic strip called, I'm not going to remember what it's called. Someone here will remember. But in the comic strip, she posed a test. And the test for any work of fiction was whether there were 2 women in it who had a conversation about anything but men. Now, this film did not pass the Bechdel test, right? And it was so easy. Also, I have to tell you where the Bechdel test came from. It came from Virginia Woolf, who is one of my saints, from A Room of One's Own. When Virginia Woolf says, all these relationships between women, I thought, rapidly recalling the splendid gallery of fictitious women, are too simple. And I tried to remember any case in the course of my reading where 2 women are represented as friends. They are now and again mothers and daughters, but almost without exception, they are shown in their relation to men. It was strange to think that all the great women of fiction were, until Jane Austen's day, not only seen by the other sex, but seen only in relation to the other sex. So I had this burning both love and not hatred per se of this film, when the next day what happened was I went to a talk with your mama. That's exactly right. So I have to admit something. I am a Luddite down to my bones. And I tried for, I think, 3 hours in Charleston, North Carolina, where I was right before I came here, to actually put a clip of this from YouTube. I couldn't figure it out. I'm sorry. So instead, I had the moment where there's applause, because that's how it lives in my head, just Katie just being applauded. So this was Katie's talk as a fellow. This is on Liturgy Matters, Benedictine Women's Communities in Medieval England. And this is the description of what she said. It reclaims the materiality of Benedictine nuns' liturgical practices by viewing these women as technologists who transformed and were transformed by their sensual engagement with the objects they created, acquired, handled, and treasured. The book she was writing situates every object within the ritual context in which it was used, interrogates the scripts directing interactions with it, and highlights its abilities to transfigure appearance, refashion identity, and reinvest authority and agency. So those of you who've had Katie in class or have seen her lecture understand what I'm about to say, which is she is an absolutely galvanizing force. She is absolutely passionate about medieval nuns. And this passion somehow flows from her into the audience. And I just want to say this to the academics in the audience. Your work does this. There wouldn't be novels without you standing up and giving these lectures that sort of fill creative writers with delight and joy. I was sitting in the audience. I was primed by the women and my love of Marie de France, and I was ready for Katie's unbelievable lecture, which changed my life. So, sitting in the audience, I was hearing her give this impassioned talk, and I sort of saw in very secular, I'm not a saint, or mystic, I saw this book I had to write, and I had to write about Marie de France as a medieval abbess, in which I could wrestle with a lot of ideas about our current day. This was something that I just saw very, very vividly. So I put aside the book that I was working on then, which was The Vaster Wilds, it's called. And I said, all right, let's get to work. And I think I took Katie out to 3 consecutive meals to ask her questions and wrote down everything that she said. And sorry, this is me in the form of Hildegard von Bingen. It's like my brain exploding I'm having this vision. And I love Hildegard too. I'm going to talk about her a little bit more because she's my favorite mystic. And I have like a whole, if they sold mystic baseball cards, I would buy all the sets. I love them so much. So the very first thing that I did was, after making Katie, ringing her out and writing down everything that she told me, was I went to books, because that's where we go. So I, of course, read Katie's book first, The Care of Nuns. It's spectacular. It's so brilliant. There are so many things in Matrix that actually comes directly from Katie's book. So, and every time they happened, they were a love letter to her for giving me the inspiration for this book. These 2 other ones are the really fun ones also. I mean, the Katie's is really fun also. But these 2 are about immodest acts, so the life of a lesbian nun in Renaissance Italy and wayward nuns in medieval literature. I read very, very widely. And I read papers, I read other books from the time, I read all over the place. And the person that I fell in love with, other than Marie, was this person here. This is from a Psalter that might have been commissioned by Eleanor of Aquitaine. And this is Eleanor of Aquitaine, apparently, who knows. But Eleanor of Aquitaine, for those of you who don't quite remember European history, was the greatest human. I don't know. I love her. I love her very, very deeply. She was born a very wealthy heiress to Aquitaine. And she was married fairly young to Louis VII, who was the king of the French in Ile-de-France. And she bore a couple of children, and then went on the Second Crusade, and thought eventually she got sick of her husband, got an annulment, leapt the Channel, and became eventually Queen of the English. And then, as she raised her children, she fomented subversion in them against her husband, Henry II. And so I find her just a fascinating figure. I read everything there is to read about her. I mean, not everything. You all read everything there is to read about her. But I read everything accessible to me. Now, I had all of this information, but I wasn't writing yet. And I wasn't writing because of a couple of impediments. The first one being literary fiction snobbishness about historical fiction. And this is real. And in fact, when I told my agent that I was working on the first book about 1609 in Jamestown, he kind of like winced a little bit. He's like, "Are you sure?" I was like, "Yeah." But, you know, and I still feel it inside myself. This is a thing. And even though Hilary Mantel has largely changed a lot of the narrative around this, it exists, and it exists within us, and it's sad, and I can trace it back. I trace it back to Henry James, whom I love very much, but he was not correct all the time. So Henry James, in this letter here, to Sarah Orne Jewett, who is this great, great novelist, American novelist, she sent him her next book, and it happened to be a historical fiction. And this is in the letter that he wrote back to her. And imagine getting this letter from Henry James. All right. The historic novel is, for me, condemned even in cases of labor as delicate as yours to a fatal cheapness. You may multiply the little facts that can be got from pictures and documents, relics and prints, as much as you like. The real thing is almost impossible to do, and in its absence, the whole effect is as naught. I mean the invention, the representation of the old consciousness, the soul, the sense, the horizon, the vision of individuals in whose minds half the things that make ours, that make the modern world, were non-existent. Go back to the country of the pointed firs. Come back to the present palpable intimate that throbs responsive and that once misses, needs you, and God knows, and suffers woefully in your absence. Right? Whoa. Also, the writing is so good. Present, palpable, intimate, that throbs responsive. Are you kidding me? It's like a mash note that's also the most devastating thing I think this woman has ever gotten in her life. So I had to get over this. And the way that I got over this was thinking through the idea of historical fiction, which is there is no such thing as ahistorical fiction. All fiction is historical. All fiction is bounded in time. And I started looking into other writers of historical fiction and how they defended it. So one of the ways they did, so one of the people is Ali Smith here that I looked at. And she wrote this, and it sank deep into me. She says, when we meet a work of art, there's something about that encounter that isn't fixed in time, but rather it unfixes time. The shaft opens. The past and present exist in the same moment, and we know as beings that we are connected. All the people who lived before us, all who will come after us, are connected in the moment. And I thought that was so beautiful, and it spoke to something that I wanted very desperately to do. I wanted to speak from the present to the past and how the past speak forward into the present. I wanted there to be a reverberation, almost like a tuning fork, struck, and then you can listen to it and you can hear it sort of tuning back and forth. That's probably not how tuning forks work, but that's how I think they do. Okay, and another thing, and another impediment to this work was my incredibly flat perception of the medieval era. And I think it came from Monty Python. I think the medievalists in the audience may agree with me that I think that the contemporary vision of the medieval world is very dark, very cold, very muddy, and everyone dies at 14 years old, right? That's basically it. So I had to find a way to actually understand the humanity and the true weirdness and richness in life there. And I very quickly stumbled upon things like these drolleries. So these are little cartoons in the corners of manuscripts, and they're so unbelievably funny. They're lovely. I don't even know what's happening here. There's a man who's a head on top of a man. I don't even understand. And there are rabbits and dogs fighting on priestly snails. There's a lion playing a violin. So there's this real irreverence here, this real feeling of subversion. And I always am attracted by the subversion and things like this. I thought that this was a way into pumping air into an airless idea of the Middle Ages. And it's not that my historical research didn't do that, of course it did, but I needed to find ways in which there's sheer, pure delight and unabashed strangeness. And through some of the art, that's where I get it. And also, looking at the art, it's just so extraordinarily beautiful. I just wanted to frame everything that I saw and put it on the wall. Okay, so I got started. And some of the threads, I'm about to tell you some of the threads that went into writing the book. And I can tell you later about the process of writing, my process of writing, which is nuts. But some of the threads I glimpsed in the beginning, and some of them developed over time. And the first one that I knew that I was going to talk about was feminine power. Now, this is a quote that I had on my wall as I was writing. Power not only acts on a subject, but in a transitive sense enacts the subject into being. This is from Judith Butler's Introduction to the Psychic Life of Power. Believe it or not, a couple of months ago, I was reading Notre Dame professor Azarine van der Vliet Uolumi's amazing Savage Tongues. It's an amazing novel that she wrote and published recently. And this is one of her epigraphs, so I knew that we were going to be friends. But this isn't this I was thinking about how power, female power in particular, can be transitive. And of course, by the time I had started this book, we were multiple years into a Trump presidency, And I kept thinking about what a Hillary presidency could have been, what female power could have looked like, and the way that I think maybe the lazy presumption of me and my cohort would be that it would be automatically better. But of course, women are human. And we have foibles and sins and hungers and lusts. And maybe our power too would be a little bit suspect. Maybe we would take power into ourselves and enact it in ways we wouldn't even know what we were doing. So another thread that I absolutely loved were female mystics. Now you saw Hildegard when my brain was exploding. This little drawing here is an anchoress, and in her little coffin box. She's so interesting. I did look at the female mystics of the age, Julian of Norwich and Marjorie Kemp, Mechtild of Magdeburg, St. Catherine of Siena. There's one, I can't pronounce her name, but it's like Hadjewicz, something like that. And I love them so much because what they did was they created space for themselves within incredibly oppressive systems by taking what is abstract, a gift from God, visions that come into the body. There's nothing more abstract than that, and making them concrete, putting them into the world, and building space for themselves, particularly Hildegard von Bingen, who I adore. My three people in this book that I keep circling around were Marie de France, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and Hildegard. Now, I love this quote from Hildegard von Bingen because it actually taught me how to write this book. Invisible and eternal things are made known through visible and temporal things. Okay, so that's amazing. That's actually the project of writing a novel, is to translate invisible things and try to make them concrete and then make them abstract through words and put them into the reader, right? So that's very hard to do, but one tries one's best. Another thing that I was thinking of when I was writing this book, another thread, is the thread of utopia. Now, every writer is given a certain number of ideas to circle around in their lives. And we may think that those ideas are limitless when we start a new project and they're distant from our previous projects. I apparently only write about utopias. Every book that I've written is about a utopia. And I love utopias. I love the idea of the microcosm, that you could jump into and explore the world as it is through the world as it is not. And Sir Thomas More, who coined the term utopia, very intentionally made it very playful. Utopos is the good place, and utopos is the place that cannot be. So a utopia inherently contains within itself its own destruction, its own negation. And I think that is such a fascinating thing to play with as a fiction writer, because as you're building something, something else is tearing it down, and that's wildly fun and interesting and exciting. I think probably the project of living in a human body on this planet is utopian, right? Because it's destined to failure, and it contains within itself its own negation, but it's still a noble act to live as well as one can on a daily basis. So this is something that I play with a lot. Now, the next one came very late in the process, labyrinths. I didn't have a structure for my book for a very, very, very long time. And I can't actually write the book fully until I have an underlying architecture. So what I write many fast drafts, and then I throw them out because I can't read my own handwriting. And legitimately, you should see it, it's terrible. And then I start over again. And I love this process so much, and I cling to it, because what it does is it allows a sense of play into the work, and the things that don't make it between one draft and another aren't alive, and they don't belong in the work. And I think that's something that with fiction, you can fall in love with your own words, you can fall in love with your own ideas, even if they're not actually working in the work itself. So it wasn't until I heard this apocryphal tale about Henry II, about how, I am almost positive this is not based in fact, but Henry II apparently in this story had this mistress named Rosamond Clifford. And in the story, he built around her this garden bower that was a labyrinth so that his evil wife, Eleanor, couldn't get in and murder the mistress. But of course, Eleanor, being Eleanor, gets in and kills her. Of course, it didn't happen this way, of course. So, but I thought, labyrinth, this is interesting. This is an earthworks in this medieval space, this landscape architecture that is keeping people from one another. And then I started seeing labyrinths everywhere. And this one is in the Cathedral of Chartres, which is my favorite cathedral on the planet. It's inset into the floor, and it's a unicursal labyrinth. And one of the theories about what it is it's supposed to symbolize the pilgrim's journey to Jerusalem. And I just thought that would be an extraordinary underlying architecture for a novel, to make a one path through a life, but also have there be patterning, bending backward, bending forward, moving through time to get to the point where you need to be. So that became my underlying structure. And then a few months before the pandemic struck, as I was really in the thick of writing, I went to visit this incredible abbey in Connecticut, and I love it so much. It's the Abbey of Regina Laudis, and the nuns there are so hospitable. It's a Benedictine abbey, and they still sing multiple times a day. There's the top picture is the abbess Lucia just after she accepted her election to abbess, and the bottom is the nuns surveying their new building. The new building is spectacularly beautiful. I got to see it before they moved in, so otherwise I would not have been able to see it. But because it's in the rule that hospitality is very, very important in the Benedictine rule, they have these guest houses, and you can apply to the abbess to come visit, and they feed you exquisite bread and cheese and soup, and you can work with the nuns within the enclosure. And it was a moment when I wanted to see what communal life was like. And nothing that happened there, except for one story that a nun told me, went into the book directly, but it was a lot of the iceberg under the surface of the book. I was able to see the way the love was so deep there, and I was profoundly moved to the point that there was a moment where I was like, maybe I won't go back to my family. Maybe I want to be a nun. When they were talking about, and I'm still getting very moved about this, how the younger nun went back to school to become a nurse in order to nurse her sisters into old age and death. And I think that is so different from the way we think about old age in the larger secular world. And it was so moving. It was just a moving experience altogether, and I loved it very, very much. Now, another thing that happened was I read this article on climate change. And when I was working on the labyrinth, suddenly I started to see the way that it became a much larger metaphor for the book here. So these are crop, what are they called? Sorry. They're called crop marks. And in the drought in England, these prehistoric buildings and structures built into the land that were lost for millennia are now coming up like ghosts to the surface of the landscape. And so you're seeing here these ghosts of buildings on the top of the surface of the landscape. What an amazing metaphor, right? And one that I could use. So I was thinking very, very deeply about how the things that we think are lost maybe still exist, maybe come back in times of distress, maybe come back when we're not expecting them, maybe exist in seed forms out in the world at large. And the final slide that I'm about to show you, and then I will read just a little bit, is this much more abstract impression that all novelists take into themselves when they're writing. So these are female artists. I surrounded myself with the work of female artists when I was writing this book. The one on the left, this one right here, is from Hilma af Klint. There was a Guggenheim show in New York City that I went to and pretty much passed out with delight and joy in front of, and actually went back 3 days in a row because it moved me so deeply. This is Group X, Altarpiece 1. It was painted in 1915. And if you're interested, she is a phenomenal person. She was a mystic also. She and her 4 friends, they called themselves De Femme, they're Swedish, got together and were spiritualists and called forth the voices of spirits from the other side and were given dictation to make all of these paintings. And only Hilma ended up actually doing any of the paintings. But this one in particular, I had this on my wall, and it is large, and I wanted that feeling to go into the book. Now, it's how do you put a feeling into a book? I don't know, but you do your best. The other one is Louise Bourgeois, and I love her so much. This is called Nature Study. She's primal. She works a lot with maternal ambivalence, which is very deep in this book and life, my life. And she works a lot with the female form. This is obviously a dog woman with a lot of teats, and I thought that it was so powerful. It's one of those things that went into the book, and I'm not sure exactly how. Okay, so that is my overall idea of what went into the book. I'm going to read just a little bit because we need to have Katie up here, and I hope that you're concocting questions for the Q&A, because I don't know if you know this about me, but I don't have a filter. And I'm very excited to answer any question you may have. Okay, so this is from the 3rd chapter. And nobody likes to hear writers read, so I'm just going to read a little. Later, Marie will remember those days just after arriving at the Abbey as thick and black. When she would peer back into that time, it was like looking from a well-lit room through the window into night. Nothing to see but her own face hovering like a moon. So hungry, the nuns' faces are skulls skinned of flesh in the dark dortoir. There are soups in which meat is boiled and removed to save for further soups. Fingernails the cold blue of sky. And then, one terse, a week after arriving, as she pretends to sing in her dismal darkness, all at once she understands what she must do. Eleanor's best currency is story, love that is given and received through song. What has come to Marie is a Breton lay in rhyming lines, sudden and beautiful in its entirety. Her hands begin to shake in her lap. She will write a collection of lays, translated to the fine musical French of the court. She will send her manuscript as a blazing arrow toward her love, and when it strikes, it will set that cruel heart aflame. Eleanor will relent. Marie will be allowed back to the court, to the place where none ever starve, and there's always music and dogs and birds and life, where at dusk the gardens are full of lovers and flowers and intrigue, where Marie can practice her languages and hear in the halls the fiery tales of new ideas shooting through conversations. Not just the tripartite God of parent and child and ghost who is talked about here, not all this endless work and prayer and hunger. Marie runs out of the chapel when the service ends and digs into her trunk and takes her money and bribes a servant to go off into town to fetch a bundle of tapers and parchment and ink and tablets of beeswax for the composition. She takes a feather from an outraged goose and whittles a pen. She moves, she breathes, she eats what little the nuns have to eat. In the night, she waits for the noises of the dortoir to smooth into sleep, then rises barefoot and creeps to the night stairs and down. The world is blue with night. The stars are sharp, accusing. Inside the barn, it is warm out of the whipping wind, and with the heat cast off by the animals' bodies, she presses her face to the horse's neck until it is no longer numb. The old warhorse turns and snuffles at Marie's cheek with her damp, soft nose. She takes out her things, careful not to awaken the servants sleeping in the loft above, and goes to where the rats click in the deepest dark, and sits upon the last few sacks of oats heaped against the stone wall. Then she strikes a spark upon the hay and causes a tiny fire that she uses to light the candle, then steps on the little fire in the hay until it's out. By this small stub of light with the eyes of rats shining green at her from the deeper dark, she writes. As she moves through the days, she imagines her lines of the night. The life of the abbey is the dream. The set of poems she is writing is the world. All right, I'll stop here, but thank you very much. And, thanks. And I'm inviting Katie out here, but also the Q&A, the microphones are here, and I would love to hear from you and to hear your questions. So come on out. All right. And we're sitting between this amazing floral arrangement that has persimmons in it. So if you need a snack, just let us know. All right. Katie, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So while you take a moment to collect your thoughts, maybe, and we really would love questions, and as you can see, the two mics are up here in the front, I'll kick off and ask a question for Lauren. So Lauren,
yes,
I want to ask you about Marie.
Okay.
And how her understanding and even giving of love changes over the course of the novel, and why it changes over the course of the novel. And I'm going to point us to two passages that I think sort of perfectly encapsulate this change from the beginning to the end. So the first comes in the very opening chapter of the novel. It's shortly after Marie arrives at the abbey, and she actually receives a short primer on monastic life from Abbess Emma. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, sort of after this short primer, Abbess Emma says this: obedience, duty, subservience, all is manifestation of love directed at the Creator. In response to this, Marie thinks, but no, love is not abasement. Love is exaltation. So that's at the very beginning of the novel. Then, at the very end of the novel, and it's actually the quote that I read in the introduction, but I'll read it again just because it's so beautiful. It's so exquisite, Lauren. We hear this: and Marie saw at that moment how she could use this greatness for her sisters. She could give up the burn of singular love inside and turn it to a larger love. She could build around her, the other women, an abbey of the spirit to protect them from cold and wet, from superiors waiting to gobble them up. She would build an invisible abbey made out of her very own self, a larger church of her own soul, an edifice of self in which her sisters would grow as babes grow in the dark, thrumming heat of the womb. So again, I guess my question is, how does Marie's love change? Why does it change? And also, why was it important for you as the creator of this character to have her change?
Mm-hmm. Well, I do think possibly the larger answer is that a novel is the chronology of a person who changes over time, right? I mean, that is the very general definition. But Marie was raised very Catholic. They had their own chapel. She went to Mass. But she was also raised by these Virago aunts, and her mother and her grandmother, and they were very busy. They were somewhat secular for the time, as secular as one possibly could be. And Marie always resisted, I think, a lot of the teaching she was given. So I would say, and then she went to the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine, and she was given over and over again these stories of courtly love. And courtly love, I see them as in opposition a little bit to the teachings of the church, particularly at the time. Now, this may not be the actual medievalists, but I see them as in opposition because in the teachings of the church, I think carnality in marriage was probably frowned upon. Is that correct? But in courtly love, it was very erotic between people who did not always happen to be married to one another, right? Adultery was okay, and it was according to, I think, these rules. And so she takes into herself all these principles and all these ideas in opposition to the church in my reading. And then as she's young when she gets to the Abbey. She's 17 years old, and a 17-year-old will have very fixed opinions, I believe, in one direction. But then she, over the course of time, she falls in love with her nuns, the nuns around her. She absolutely adores them individually and as a collective, and she's proud of what she has done to affect change. And she wants to, as you read in the passage, she wants to build a church of herself to protect them. This is her greatness. She's not a good inside herself. She doesn't feel like a good person, but she does feel like she's a great person. So she changes over the course of time, and her love of her fellow nuns is the thing that lets God into her, I think, and I wanted to track faith, and I wanted to track maybe a non-traditional idea of what faith is, and this is partially because it sort of also tracks somewhat autobiographically from who I am and who I was. Although I was raised by two parents who were Anabaptists at first, and then they became Presbyterian, very strict Presbyterian in upstate New York, and I was in the church every Sunday, up and down for 4 hours because it's a very long service. And it's very cold because, it's a really big church and they couldn't heat it enough. So suffering is good in Calvinism. And yet for me, belief and faith was a very animal thing. It was a very carnal thing, and it was a very private thing. It was in the Bible that had been given, I think, just offhandedly, but it was my treasure, and because it was this beautiful object, the gilding on the paper. I just love it, and the softness of the paper and the onion skin, you can see through it, and the leather was just really beautiful too, and the smell of this Bible. I mean, I responded to it as an animal, and then I started reading it. And there are incredible stories in the Bible, right? For a child in particular. Suddenly there's, killings and sex and wild things happening. So narratively, it was attractive. As an animal, it was an attractive text. And then through that, I became fairly fervent and devout. And then I turned at one point to literature and away from religious feeling. And literature became my religious feeling. And then, this may be trite, but when I had children, something new sparked in me. And it felt like the spark of the divine, and I don't know what that means, but I do know that I started feeling much more spiritual without necessarily going back to the religion of my youth. So it tracks that I'm feeling, as I'm growing older, like Marie in some ways, more intensely involved in spiritual matters and in the flame that lives in all humans. And I believe it does, yeah.
Beautiful.
Please don't be shy.
Yes. Or I'll just keep asking questions.
Come
Come
up
here to the
please.
mic.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll ask a question. Am I audible?
Yes.
About something I found poignant in the novel, both with the building of the labyrinth and with the building of the dam.
Okay.
The narrative voice comes in to point out the destruction and exile of the wildlife in both places, especially the red salamander, which I would like to hear more about. It seems as if you're showing Marie and the nuns doing to the natural world what men have been doing to them, overlooking and harming. And I just wanted to hear a little bit more about that impulse to point that aspect of things out.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. It was a wonderful question. One of my impulses in writing this book was to think through the way that anthropocentric religion, religions that put humans at the very, very center of things, have led to climate change. And I think they have very profoundly. And another impulse, too, was to think through sort of the pseudo-capitalism of Marie and the way that it has, in its constant hunger and devouring nature, profoundly negative effects on the environment. I also want to say, too, this book stands alone, but I do see it as a voice in a triptych of voices of different projects that I'm working on, all of which are talking about issues of God, of women within the boundaries of a hierarchical world and structure, of the way that humans have possibly misread Genesis, and instead of dominion over the earth and the creatures that they're in, we have misread it as domination, and that has led to climate change, and we need to own up to that in order to possibly solve that. So all of these things are part of this triptych, and Matrix is the first in the 12th century, and then The Vaster Wilds, which is my next book out in 2023, is in 1609 in Jamestown. It's like a female Robinson Crusoe. And it's very Protestant and very severe. And then the last one is set now, and I can't talk about it because it's actually actively killing me. And it's a fight to the death. One of us is going to win. I don't know which one. Yeah. Thank you for your question. Thank you. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Hi.
Sorry, I don't want to yell into the mic too loud. I don't know how close I need to be. I had a question about Marie's character, too. So when I was reading, something that I kept coming across was that it seems like Marie views herself as a liberator to the women that she's coming to. And then I think, like the last question, the answer you were just discussing, it also seems like in an attempt to liberate the women that she's come across from a patriarchal structure that they've been excluded from, she is still engaging in capitalist destruction, or I guess it's the 1000, so pseudo-capitalist destruction,
Right.
Environmentalist destruction, and I love that last passage that you read because to me there's like a little negativity there read into her seeking power and seeking personal glory, maybe even cult-like glory through that role. And so I wanted to know if you saw that as a contradiction, if that contradiction was purposeful, and if it was, is it an attempt to reflect something you think in the present day that we're working through?
Yes. Did everyone hear the question? Was the mic on? Yes? You didn't hear it? Okay. So I'm going to repeat the question as much as I can remember of it. It's about the fact that Marie's... actually, you repeat it because you're probably smarter than me.
That's not true at all. That's not true at all. Well, I think building really well on Professor Marvin's question, thinking about how Marie really uses her power for greatness. And as she admits, it's not always for goodness. And we see her efforts to dominate, not just over the created world, but also thinking of the women that are ostensibly under her care as well. And just thinking about the complexity of Marie's character and why write her in that way. And I'm curious to know, too, just in terms of how it might build off Professor Marvin's question, too.
So it was incredibly intentional. Right? I did this on purpose. I never meant this book to be a hagiography, and in fact, I think they're interesting. But I think that I made Marie very flawed as a human being and subject to great bouts of ego and narcissism in order to think through ideals of female power and how they would differ from regular structures of power. And I think often, when we think that we're subverting modes of power and hierarchies, we don't always see our actions as also at the same time imposing those hierarchies and systemic issues upon other people. And I think that there is profound harm in that. And it's a part of human nature to impose things that we're fighting against on other people. And that sounds very dark, but if you accept it, then possibly you can see it in yourself, right? If you accept that this is a truth possibly common to humanity, then when you do impose these strictures, these very painful things on other people, you can see yourself doing it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I know there's a question over here, too.
My question is nowhere near as precise in its formulation, but more of a kind of series of observations that I have about what you said and the part that you read aloud, and asking you to reflect on what I've seen. But so when you're describing your nonlinear and kind of labyrinthine process of writing, and similarly the structure of the novel, that section, the very end of what you read, reminded me of a point of in If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler. So
Calvino.
sitting and writing in darkness, not knowing if those words will ever be read by anyone. And so you have Marie's composition by night, and then you also have the sense of the oblivion of much of personal history that we have for women of this time. And Marie's in particular, but also similarly the legacy of Radcliffe as a women's college that is no more and has been sort of subsumed within Harvard's structure. And the resonance is there, if you could just speak on that.
Yeah, that's amazing. I was thinking about absence a lot and the void a lot, and particularly the absence of voices in humans that we knew to be extant but were erased. I mentioned this in an earlier class, so forgive me for mentioning it again to other people, but one of the profound changers, one of the people who have changed my thinking very profoundly is Saadia Hartman, whose project is to go back into history and reclaim those empty, voided spaces voided deliberately by outside forces. And the modes in which she does this are just unbelievably interesting. And fiction is used, I think. I don't know if she would call it fiction, but I see it as fictional exercises in certain cases. Do you know Saadia Hartman? Yeah, she's a legit genius. Actually, MacArthur genius, so legit. I think everyone should read her. She's so interesting. So I do think that, yes, Radcliffe, I hadn't thought of that. I hadn't made that connection at all, but thank you for making that connection. It's true. There's an erasure there by being subsumed by the larger community. And that does equal a lot of the voices that have been absorbed without recognition back into the larger, I guess, literature, right? Into the larger idea of literature. Because the things that we think of as folk tales, for instance, or fairy tales, tended to be primarily women's stories, and a lot of them were molded through time and became collective stories without individual authors attached to them. Or the Grimms actually took these stories and put their own male name on them. And Poe also, I think. And so I think that this is just a common thing that has happened through time. And then to take a work of fiction like the one I have written and ones other people write, and to try to resist that by telling a story that even though the stories within that story have been lost, possibly the existence of the book itself is testament to those voices that have been lost. So yeah, thank you for your series of amazing flashes of insight. Yeah.
Wonderful. We've got another question over here.
Hi, I like your
Thank you.
hat.
Hello, thank you. This is very inspiring. I'm so excited to be here. I'm going to lower the discourse a little bit right now and ask you if you can talk about your glittery Oscar de la Renta dress from last night that like matches your book cover. I didn't know like regular people, you're not like a regular person, but I didn't know like regular people could get Oscar de la Renta. I was like, where do you, like, what happened? How does that happen? So thank you.
So last night was the National Book Awards. I lost. It's fine. I'm not upset. All that upset. Poor Katie had to talk me down from the ledge last night. I was at her kitchen table, like in my beautiful Oscar de la Renta dress. So I don't have Oscar de la Renta money. I'm a writer, but I do have the Real Real, and it's an amazing website where you can buy secondhand designer clothing. And that's where I bought my second. It's also better for the environment, you know. It's better. So yeah, I wanted. That was actually the third dress that I tried from the Real Real for the National Book Awards, because normally when it's not a pandemic year, you get to go to this incredible, like very glamorous party with photographers and a red carpet, and everyone's dressed up, which for book people is hilarious. Right? It's like, you know, you're like, oh yeah, I've seen you on the author. You don't look like that. And you sit around, and it's just like this wild night of epic glamour in a you know, there's no glamour in literary fiction. But I like to dress up, and I also felt like the pandemic was so long, and I would been wearing yoga pants, the same ones that were ripped, for like 18 months. And I just felt we all needed a little bit of glamour, even though it was behind a screen. So the Real Real is great. Go for it. It's better for the environment. And if that's not your style, ThreadUp is pretty good too. ThreadUp is another consignment used clothes on the internet store.
Hi. Since we're talking about religion and now fashion, I have a question to sort of bring the two together.
Love it.
I was just wondering if you by chance happened to go to that exhibit at the Met a few years ago by the Costume Institute. It was Catholicism and or fashion in the Catholic imagination.
No, but Molly Gower, who I think might be listening, took a group of people there. Yeah,
Oh,
she
okay.
told me about it. Yeah.
I saw some overlap with the kinds of things that you've been talking about. There's these beautiful vestments that have been sewn by nuns, and of course you don't have any of the names of the people who have done this incredible embroidery work and stitching. Of course you have the name of the person who wore it, but not any of the artists. And anyway, I was hoping that maybe you could comment on that, because I just see some resonance with the types of things you were talking about here with religious imagination and you know, voices being or people being sort of erased and voices being subdued. So
I love this. That is so smart.
Thank you.
And it's true, tapestries, textile art tend to be feminine arts, right? And the makers tend to be forgotten. Up until recently, when you stick a tag on it and it says Oscar de la Renta, right? So I think that's a really incredible point. And one of the things that I looked at repeatedly, actually obsessively, I couldn't go to bed without looking at it, is the Bayeux Tapestry, which is basically from that time, right? Believe it or not, on Wikipedia, you can actually scroll through the entire thing, and it's a very, very beautiful. There's a mysterious nun named Alfgifu, Gift of the Elves, and we don't know who she is, but there is also an abbess from a couple of centuries earlier, right?
Well, in the 12th century, end of the 11th, but the abbess of Barking, but also there was an abbess of Shaftesbury named Alfgifu too.
Alfgifu. I mean, that's a rare name, so maybe it's the same Alfgifu. No, yeah, I don't. I proposed this to Katie. She said no, probably not. I'm making historical inroads here. But I was fascinated, right? Because I don't know who made the Bayeux Tapestry. It could have been a group of Flemish men, but for some reason, because it's a tapestry, I doubt it. I doubt it. I don't know what you think. You actually know things about history.
Yeah, I mean, I think at this time period, I mean, most of these I mean, something as exquisite as that is probably being done by a woman. It's probably being done by a woman.
That's the quote of the night.
But to piggyback on that,
Yeah.
I mean, something that's really fascinating, though, about the novel is that you have, here, Joseph, there, you have Marie change the economy of the monastery in terms of the physical work that the women are engaged in. Mm-hmm. So they had primarily been doing embroidery work mm-hmm. under Abbess Emma, mm-hmm. and then with Marie, they opened the scriptorium. Mm-hmm. And of course, this was actually much more lucrative mm-hmm. for the community. But it's also interesting thinking that they're moving from, I mean, this sort of like physical, tactile, textual work that they're doing, and then moving toward like intellectual labor. I mean, it's still physical, but definitely very physical. I mean, copying manuscripts, but why the shift then?
Because of you. This is one of those things that came directly out of Katie's scholarship about how, about how women were deeply involved in the creation of manuscripts. So one of the things that Katie showed us all, which blew my mind and actually gave rise to a character in this book when she was doing her lecture. I feel weird talking about you as though you're. Can you talk about the dental calculus?
Sure.
Thank you.
This is not my archaeological discovery. It's not my archaeological discovery, but early 2019, there was a scientific study that came out. A group of archaeologists, but also a few medievalists were involved as well. The remains of a nun, based on the DNA evidence, probably dates to the 11th, maybe the 12th century, in the Rhineland, so what is now Germany. And in the dental tartar, the dental calculus of the remains, they found pigments of lapis lazuli that were left in the dental calculus. And what's amazing about this discovery is that it sort of gives us really concrete evidence that nuns probably worked as illuminators of manuscripts, and that what probably was the case for this nun is that she would wet the tip of her brush with her mouth, and that the pigments of the paint remained in her teeth. And what's even more extraordinary is that lapis lazuli at this time was the most precious pigment that would be used in producing manuscripts, even more expensive than gold leaf, because it would have to be imported from what is now Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And so these women were not just artists, but they were entrusted with materials that were incredibly precious, costly, and so they had to have been incredibly skilled to work with these pigments as well. And so medievalists have, for a long time known that women were doing these things, but those of us who have claimed this have said, well, you don't have physical evidence for this, but we now have a body. We now have a body that shows us that they were actually doing this. So,
can you also talk about the change of the Latin into the feminine? Oh, I love this.
And I see one of our great medievalists here at Notre Dame here too, and so I'm curious to know what Professor Fassler has to say too. So we're going to have her come up to the mic in just a moment. But what Lauren is referring to is looking at how many of these female scribes, yes, many of them composed original works on their own. But what I also find really fascinating is how many of these nuns, especially when they were working on prayer texts for their community, would borrow prayers from other types of liturgical books. What I have found extremely interesting is that we see nuns often borrowing from books that were usually used by priests. So missals, sacramentaries, and taking the prayers from those texts, adapting them for their own use. And so one of the love notes from Lauren, now that I know that they're little love notes to me, is this really interesting prayer, Suscipe Sancta Trinitas, receive Holy Spirit. It was the kind of prayer that it was is an apologia. It's a type of penitential prayer that a priest would recite before reciting the canon of the Mass. So it's a form of confession. And in an early 11th century prayer book from Leominster Abbey, which is in Western England, we see a community of nuns take that prayer, which was for a priest, and take all of the masculine grammatical forms that would be used to refer to the person praying the prayer and making them feminine so that a woman could pray them. And what's even more interesting is that in the manuscript, what precedes the prayer is a rubric, so a direction for how the prayer is supposed to be said and when it's supposed to be said. And the direction, and it's in Old English, says that the prayer is supposed to be said at the offering of the Mass. And so then it also then not only, so woman using a prayer that would have been used by a priest in the context of the Mass as a form of confession, but also that this prayer was potentially also used in the context of the Mass by a woman asking for absolution before doing, we're not sure what, but somehow involved in the consecration of the Eucharist. So, yeah.
Right? It's so subversive, her work. It's amazing. Fills
right.
me with joy. Yes, please. I'm sorry.
Fast.
Are we on here?
You're on.
I just wanted to ask you a question based on my work on Hildegard, whom you mentioned and like a lot, clearly. I've studied her play a lot, the Ordo Virtutum, her sung play. And in that work and some of my other work on her, I've realized that she's shaping her texts for her community, giving them to the community in the way that the passage that Katie read and that you discussed resonates quite deeply. And I can see her thinking about the problems of the women and their particular voices and problems that need to be solved in those women, and then creating works of art that will help them work them out. I think the play is kind of a group confessional, actually. Wow. And so I wondered if these things rise out of Marie's works, or if you what do you think about that idea?
I absolutely agree. I mean, I don't know anything, you do. But my reading of Hildegard is of her as an acutely sensitive abbess, deeply invested in the women around her and their needs. And so that was my supposition, but of course I didn't have a whole lot of history behind that idea. I did read everything that she has written that's available to me. And you get an impression, my job is sentences, and of course they're being translated, and so maybe I'm missing something too. But I do get the sense of her as a woman of incredible willpower, of incredible insight into human nature and the people around her. A person who's able to see other people's foibles and weaknesses and actually work with that. I think of her as just a genius. I mean, she was a genius. She was like in multiple directions, in music, in medicine, as you know. But I do find in her texts, and this is, I'm not you, but I do find in her text the profound sensitivity to all the people around her, and I did steal that from Marie. I stole a lot from Hildegard for Marie. Yeah. You saw it too, Katie, right?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
So we're gonna have one more question, and I know that many of you are really eager to have copies, your copies of Matrix signed by Lauren, and so we're gonna do that, but we're gonna turn things over to Annie Killian for our last question.
Thank you, Lauren. Could you talk about the Crusades in the book? We have the beginning where Maria's a child on this woman's crusade, and that scene comes back several times because it's where she first sees Eleanor. And then later, almost maybe even before every visionary moment, there's the setup with a crusade has been announced and the sense of darkness and thinking about connections to today. So much of 9/11 and the war on terror has been framed as a crusade. So could you, say how the crusade is looming and developing throughout the novel?
What a brilliant question. I have to tell you, I've been on the road for about 2.5 months, and I haven't gotten a lot of these questions before, which is unusual. So the Crusades for me, I was trying to think about this, the early church and the way that it's connected to the world now. And that struck me as a moment, obviously, where an empire was growing and pushing with its hunger. And of course, now we live in a series of empires, right? And we have been living in a series of empires ever since the Crusades. So I saw the Crusades as maybe not the birth of capitalism, but sort of a proto-capitalism in a certain way. And it does haunt Marie. I have found nothing in the historical record of children, other than the Children's Crusade, which is another thing, but of children actually going with their parents. But I needed her to be there in order to see a young Eleanor. I also, there's so much that you can look at in the historical record as a novelist and just be full of joy about. And the idea of the ladies' army, even though it's probably apocryphal, it makes me so happy to imagine these early, mid-12th century women in their silken crusader tunics with their swords and their hair loosed, galloping down the hillside, and striking terror into people watching. I love that image so much that even if it's not historically true, I put it into my book, because that's my job. It's to find these emotional truths, these emotional moments that strike the characters and reverberate through their lives, and that was one of those things. So the Crusades are something for me to sort of to think through the budding of empire, of Christian empire. Yeah.
Wonderful. All right. I'm very grateful to all of you for your time and attention this evening. In just a moment, we're going to thank Lauren, but just a couple of housekeeping things. So we're going to ask you all to sort of exit through the back, and Lauren is going to be at a table that's going to be sort of on the opposite side of the hall if you're wanting to get your copy of Matrix signed. If you do not yet own a copy of Matrix but would like to purchase a copy of Matrix, you are able to do so. Representatives from the bookstore are here and are selling copies not only of Matrix but other works of Lauren too. So I encourage you to purchase them if you are so inclined. But really, I am just so delighted that Lauren is here, and so I'm going to ask you to help me thank Lauren for being here.
Thank you, Katie Buckish, for being here. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here on a cold November night. That's really lovely. All right.